welcome to Out of the Box Radio with me, your host, Christine Blasdale. Out of the Box Radio is a weekly podcast of audible ear candy dedicated to bringing a fresh perspective on this thing that we call life. And each and every week, we're going to be diving into the topics that matter most with lively conversations on issues such as health, wellness, and transformational healing, all with the goal of creating a better world and becoming a happier human being. I will be your tour guide for this epic adventure, and each and every week we're going to be embarking on a journey with the ultimate goal being transformation to our highest potential. And now, let's get out of the box. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Out of the Box Radio. I'm your host, Christine Blasdale, and as you may or may not know, this week marks the 54th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas. And my guest this hour is an absolute, I consider him an expert on the Jfk Assassination, as do many other people. And he's been involved in hundreds, if not thousands, of conferences on the subject. And he's written many, many columns on it. Jfk Fetzer is a former Marine Corps officer, is a McKnight Professor Emeritus of the Duluth campus of the University of Minnesota, and co-editor of moonrockbooks.com. He is joining us today for this entire hour to talk about this particular subject matter, and on the anniversary, again, the 54th anniversary of the assassination of our President John F. Kennedy. Welcome to Out of the Box Radio, Jfk Fetzer.
Oh, thanks, Christine. I'm delighted to be with you. Yes, I have chaired or co-chaired 5 national conferences, Minneapolis 1999, Duluth, Dallas 2000, Dallas 2001, Duluth 2003, and Santa Barbara on the occasion of the 50th. Jack and Jackie had honeymoon in Santa Barbara. I've published now 4 books on JFK where I bring together the best experts on different aspects of the case. The first, Assassination Science, published in 1998, brought together a world authority on the human brain who is also an expert on wound ballistics. Bob Livingston, MD, who founded the first department of neuroscience at the University of California, San Diego. David W. Manick, MD, PhD. David has a PhD in physics from Wisconsin, an MD from Michigan, board certified in radiation oncology, which of course is a treatment of cancer using X-ray therapy, so that he's an expert on the interpretation of X-rays. Charles Crenshaw, MD, who was in trauma room number 1 when JFK's moribund body was brought in, and then 2 days later was responsible for the care and treatment of his alleged assassin, Lee Oswald. Jack White, a legendary photo and film analyst. John P. Costello, another PhD in physics, this time with expertise in electromagnetism, the properties of light and images of moving objects, where he did brilliant work. He has a tutorial online you can access at assassinationscience.com, my very first website, where John and I co-edited assassinationresearch.com, which is a journal for advanced study of the death of JFK. And that was the very first, shattering the cover-up by showing that the autopsy x-rays had been altered to conceal a fist-sized blowout at the back of the head, that there were actually indications of a second shot to the head that were internal to the x-rays, the distribution of metallic particles, that the brain shown in diagrams and photographs in the National Archives was not the brain of JFK, and that the Zapruder film has been massively edited, indeed, based upon my research as of this date. The original film would have included more than twice as many frames as the 487 that are in the extant version. They took out 100 frames turning from Houston onto Elm because the driver, William Greer, swung out too widely, nearly hit a concrete abutment, had to hesitate and get back into line, which would have shaken the public's confidence in the protection provided the president by the Secret Service, where in fact we have over 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting him up for the hit, and another 400 which had to conceal the fact that the driver, William Greer, pulled the limousine to the left into a halt after bullets began to be fired to make sure JFK would be killed. He was hit in the back of the head by a shot fired from the Dow Tex, slumped forward. Jack eased him back up and was looking him right in the face when he was hit in the right temple by a frangible or exploding bullet that shot up shockwaves that blew his brains out the back of his his head to the left rear, where when the impacted motorcycle patrolman Bobby Hargis riding there, he initially thought he himself had been shot. Obviously, they had to take all that out. Larry Rivera has now recovered interviews that Fred Newcomb, a first-generation student of JFK, had conducted with the 4 motorcycle escort officers and their supervisor, Stavis Ellis, and has discovered that during the stop, Hargis actually got off his bike, ran between the 2 limos, which would have been impossible had they been in motion, up toward the grassy knoll from which he believed shots had been fired. Officer Jackson on the right motored up the grassy knoll until his bicycle fell over, and then he proceeded on foot. Meanwhile, 5 agents dismounted the Secret Service Cadillac and surrounded the presidential. One took a chunk of skull from a little boy and threw it into the back seat while Clint Hill was rushing forward to push Jackie back into the back seat. She climbed out on the trunk after a big chunk of Jack's skull and brains. Then Clint lay down across their bodies and was the first to peer into this gaping, bloody, fist-sized hole at the back of JFK's head, which was obviously mortal. He was dead instantly. Turned to his colleagues, gave him a thumbs down. All of that had to be removed. And when they did so and contracted the number of frames, although Jack had slumped to the left, they took out so many frames, it appeared to be a violent back and to the left. So we have another 400 frames removed there. In other words, the original film would have included over 1,000 frames, whereas today we have 487, and those we have been edited and revised themselves by, for example, blacking out the blowout at the back of the head. In the early frames, like 3, 14, 15, 16, 17, where it occurred to me that it might be the case they'd overlooked that the blowout could be seen in later frames. And when I searched, I found in frame 374, you can actually see the blowout at the back of the head. This is when Jackie is just starting to climb out onto the trunk. And when you compare that with David Mantick's brilliant dissection of the autopsy X-ray, where he delineates area P, where it had been patched to conceal that blowout to the back of the head, there's a very striking correspondence between area P and the blowout, as you can actually see it at the back of the head. So that was the first of my 3 original books on JFK. The second, Murder in Dealey Plaza, an overview. 3 essays by David Mantick. Douglas Horn contributes about how we know the film was taken back to the National Photographic Interpretation Center already on Saturday, the 23rd. That the substitute was brought from Rochester, New York, where the CIA has a secret film lab called Hawkeye Weeks on Sunday, and the replacement of the original was made. And a third, all on the Great Zapruder film hoax, Christine, where I'll just tie off by adding, yes, I've done over 1,000 interviews on JFK, many presentations you can find online, where the most recent is on the Brian Rue RUHE show. Just put in Brian Rue JFK and you'll find a 2-hour overview where I present all the evidence.
I told my listeners that you were an expert on JFK assassination. Oh my God. Wow. Jim, I would say every year when I bring up this subject, and, I've worked in radio, I have worked with a lot of very fine journalists in their own right, people who claim to want to, bring out the truth and for justice. And I'll tell you, and I know you've encountered this as well, along the lines of even the progressive media, this is like they don't want to look at it. They don't want to admit it. This is something that I mean, myself, and I know you as well, I've been labeled a conspiracy nut, tinfoil hat wearing, blah, blah, blah. And with this mountain, I mean, in the first 5 minutes of this show, you laid out enough information that a child with no formal education would look at this and go, oh my God. I mean, this was like overkill. They wanted to make sure that this man, and it was a public execution as well, which I think was a psyops. I mean, the psychological impact that had on the nation and his children coming. I was born in 1964, and the trauma of that event was still present when I came into this world. So my question is to you on this anniversary, the 54th anniversary of the assassination, how do you handle people who say, "Oh, come on now, it was Lee Harvey Oswald, it was a lone patsy, and get over it. This is just a conspiracy theory"? What do you say to those people?
Well, they're either unfamiliar with the evidence or cognitively impaired. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Christine, that the very day of the assassination, NBC ran a 5-hour coverage. And during that 5 hours, including with Chet Huntley, among the most famous newsmen in the country at the time, that they explained that the president had been shot in the throat. This was a small, clean puncture wound. When Malcolm Kilduff, the acting press secretary, announced the death of the president at 1 p.m., he pointed to his right temple and said it was a simple matter of a bullet right through the head. NBC would also report that, attributing that finding to Admiral George Berkeley, the president's personal physician. Malcolm Perry and Kent Clark, where Perry had performed a simple tracheostomy incision through this small, clean puncture wound, and where Kent Clark was the director of neurosurgery who'd called the president dead, reported to a press conference known as the Parkland press conference at 1:33 different times that the bullet was coming at him, that it had been a wound of entry. And that was being broadcast on NBC, and the other networks were doing similar reports, but the one with which I'm especially familiar is NBC. So that these two wounds were widely broadcast in radio and television. In fact, I mentioned Bob Livingston, MD. He was the scientific director of the National Institutes for Neurological Diseases and Blindness at the National Institutes for Health, which are located in Bethesda, across the street from Bethesda Naval Hospital. So because he was an expert in wound ballistics, having supervised an emergency medical hospital for injured Okinawans and Japanese prisoners of war during World War II, he recognized from the description of the small, clean puncture wound in the throat that it was a wound of entry. So he determined that he would call the pathologist who would be responsible for conducting the autopsy at Bethesda, Commander James Humes, and he reached him through the officer of the day. And he explained to Humes that from this description, it was clear that this was a wound of entry, and therefore Humes needed to be very careful in dissecting the neck because, and this is so ironic in retrospect, if there were any evidence of shots from behind, then there's proof of at least two shooters and therefore a conspiracy. Believe it or not, the FBI interrupted the conversation. They weren't allowed to converse further. But it's very, very interesting that later in the evening, Humes would call Livingston and ask him what the wound would have looked like had it been a wound of exit. And Bob described it for him. And in fact, it turns out Humes used that information to change the wound physically into a wound of exit, given Bob's description. I mean, it's this grotesque when we get through the history of it. As the story started to trickle in that the shooter had been above and behind, Frank McGee, who is nobody's fool, says, "This is incongruous. How can the man have been shot from in front, from behind?" So that even, the very first day, the day of the actual shooting, these two wounds, both of which had been fired by shots from the front, actually the throat shot had passed through the windshield in transit, and from the right front, fired from the intersection of the triple underpass and the picket fence, where there's an above-ground sewer opening. Both those shots had been fired from in front, so that when, in fact, the government official account started to, come in, where the FBI and the Secret Service concluded already the day of the shooting there had been 3 shots, that Jack had been hit in the back, about 5.5 inches below the collar, just to the right of the spinal column. The Conley had been hit in the back, and the Jack had been hit in the back of the head. If you disregard the shot to Conley and just look at the shots to Jack, you got 4 shots. You got a shot to the back, which actually was the first hit. You got the shot to the throat, which actually was the second hit. You got the shot to the back of the head, which actually was the third hit. And then you got the shot to the right temple, which was the 4th hit on JFK. There were at least 8 to 10 shots fired altogether, including multiple misses, which I can inventory as you may like. But the fact is, we already knew that day, or within 2 days, if we were paying attention, that Jack had been hit himself 4 different times from multiple different directions, and therefore a conspiracy was not in doubt.
Oh, but don't you know that was that one magic bullet? That was that one magic bullet, Jim Fetzer, that magically bounced around all over the place. And this was presented, the magic bullet theory. And if you can let our listeners know a little bit about this, but this theory was presented to the public, and cognitive dissonance, I don't know. The power that people in authority or our politicians have, or I don't know, but people bought it. Let's talk about this magic bullet theory that was.
Well, it's very interesting as to whether or not people bought it, but they were certainly trying to sell it.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. They sold it. Yeah.
So this was what the government was marketing. Here's what happened, Christine. It turned out that one of the shots had missed. It hit a distant curbing and injured a bystander by the name of James Tague. Now, since the government had committed itself to only 3 shots, once it was discovered that Tague had been injured, I mean, his chin was actually cut by a piece of concrete from the curbing, they had to now account for all the wounds based upon only 2 shots. Well, they got the back of the head killing him, so they have to play with what else they've got. They've got a wound to the throat that's an entry wound. They got the blowout at the back of the head. They deal with that by the subterfuge of actually, believe it or not, taking a cranial saw to the skull of JFK and enlarging the wound at Bethesda to make it look more like something that might have been caused by a shot from the rear, entering low at the base and exiting at the top, so that Commander Humes would later testify during his deposition by the Assassination Records Review Board, a 5 civilian member board that was created by Congress in 1992 with in the wake of the resurgence of interest generated by Oliver Stone's film JFK, to declassify documents and records held by the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, Office of Naval Intelligence, and so forth, where only the president could override them. George Herbert Walker Bush, then president, adamantly opposed it, but it passed anyway. So he refused to appoint the members to the panel, which had to await the incoming Clinton administration, 18 months delay, basically giving the agencies a chance to clean up their act, to sanitize their files before they were appointed. It had now a deadline of 25 years for the release of all documents, which is why now in 2017, we have the final release of documents. There are some interesting items there I'll discuss with you. But in the meanwhile, the Warren Commission was troubled and had to mess with the back wound and somehow account for the throat wound. So they had Gerald Ford, who was then a junior member of the Warren Commission, redescribe the back wound from his uppermost back, which was already a falsification because it had actually been 5.5 inches below the collar to the right of the spinal column, to the base of the back of the neck. And to maintain that the bullet had gone in the base of the back of the neck, passed through the neck without hitting any bony structures, and come out the throat. See, so now the throat wound, which was in fact an entry wound, is turned into an exit wound, and then go into the back of Connolly. So you no longer need that separate shot to John Connolly. In fact, Connolly may have been hit as many as 3 different times, as I can reconstruct. But that's what they tried to foist off on the American people. They ignored the entry wound in the right temple. They enlarged the back of the head wound, which was a fist-sized blowout. There was a shot to the back of the head where David Mandig has been able to determine its entry from beveling in a chunk of bone known as the Harper fragment. It may have been that piece of skull that was taken from a little boy who was returned to Dealey Plaza and then found the following day by a medical student by the name of Billy Harper, who had a relative at Methodist Hospital who photographed and determined it was a chunk of occipital parietal bone from the back of the head. And where they then, therefore, could account for all of that by creating this huge missing back of the head, which is described with mathematical detail in the Bethesda autopsy report, completely contradicting the dimensions and size. It was a fist-sized wound. If you double up your fist and reach behind the back of your head, that's approximately where it was located. That's a very good close facsimile to what we're talking about. But then they claimed, you see, now that The bullet had entered the base of the back of the neck, traversed, gone into the back of Connolly, shattered a rib, exited his chest, hit his right wrist, wound up in his left thigh. When shown the bullet that was alleged to have performed all these feats, Robert Shaw, MD, who was caring for John Connolly, said he thought it was most unlikely that bullet could have performed all those feats because he'd removed more lead from John Connolly's wrist than was missing from that bullet. But that is the feat that they sought to foist off on the American people. It's called the magic bullet because if you know where it actually entered, right, then it's taking this dramatic shift, which is a physiological impossibility, coming out his neck and so forth. Even the New York Times, when it published a paperback version of the Warren Commission report, had a diagram of the bullet, but it doesn't exit the throat. That means you would still have the throat wound to account for. I mean, it's amazing how blatant have been the disproofs of the Warren Commission, Christine, and yet many people think they would like to believe it, but they have never really looked at the evidence. Now, David Mantik took a patient with similar chest and neck dimensions to JFK and created a CAT scan and plotted the official trajectory. And it's not even anatomically possible because cervical vertebrae intervene. In other words, what they did with the magic bullet is have Arlen Specter ask the physicians who knew better the following hypothetical question, which boils down to this. If we assume the bullet entered the back of the base of the neck, if we assume it transited without hitting any bony structures, if we assume it came out the front of the neck, would that be consistent with describing the wound at the front of the neck as a wound of exit, which, of course, is trivially true? I mean, if you make those assumptions, right, it's impossible that it not be true. So that Malcolm Perry, for example, who knew much better, said, yes, that was correct, but he was not in a position to vouch for or verify the assumptions he had been asked to make, which, in fact, were fantastic. He knew they weren't true. Specter didn't ask him, what did you see? What did you observe? What kind of wound, which Malcolm Perry had already described 3 times as a wound of entry during the Parkland press conference. David has proven it's not even anatomically possible, which is why Specter included the claws passing through the neck without hitting any bony structures. And why, when they do these reconstructions of the magic bullet on ABC, Discovery, History Channel, what have you, they use a simulation, a stand-in for JFK that's missing a crucial anatomical feature. It has no backbone, which is ironic because the reason JFK was taken out was precisely because he did have backbone.
Oh, that leads me to two points. Number one, of course, using the corporate media, using the news, the Walter Cronkites, the ABC News, there was one journalist that very disturbed when I found out. Was it Dan Rather? Yeah, Dan Rather. Dan Rather has something to do with this. But the question is when you mentioned about JFK's backbone, so to speak, who, and maybe you don't know, but who on earth would want lovely John F. Kennedy dead? Who would want to see him dead?
Well, I've given so many presentations. I'm glad to spell this out because it's crucial that you differentiate between the sponsors, the individuals and groups who wanted him out, primarily on the basis of policy differences between JFK and LBJ. The mechanics, the actual shooters on the ground, their supervisors and coordinators, where I've identified 6 of the shooters by name, rank, and serial number from where they fired, the effects their bullets had, whether they were hits or misses, where their supervisors, and this may astonish you, include George Herbert Walker Bush, which is why he was opposing the release of these documents. He was actually in the Daltech supervising an anti-Castro Cuban by the name of Nestor Tony Escadro, who was using a Mannlicher Carcano, a World War II antique weapon known as a humanitarian rifle for never harming anyone on purpose, firing 3 shots without being silenced. In other words, all the other weapons in Dealey were silenced, but for this Mannlicher Carcano, which is in suitable proximity to the book depository, could set up the acoustical impression of 3 shots having been fired, and it would be very difficult, virtually impossible auditorily to distinguish between the location from which they were actually fired in the Daltex and the 6th floor of the book depository, the assassin's lair from which no shots were fired at all. I mean, it's really fascinating. So that, and where Edward Lansdale, who was an Air Force general responsible for assassinations all over the world, appears to be the party who positioned the shooters and determined the sequence in which the shots would be taken. We have photos of Lansdale and Dealey Plaza walking past the so-called three tramps, whom I've now come to believe were fallback patsies. I got to know one of them, the third, often misidentified as E. Howard Hunt. His name actually Chauncey Marvin Holt. He prepared 15 sets of Ford Secret Service credentials for use in and around Dealey Plaza at the instruction of his CIA handler, Philip Twombly. We have another photograph of Bush in front of the book depository. We have a third photograph where Lansdale's waiting to speak to Bush. Bush, ironically, was arrested coming out of the Dow Tex by an officer, R.E. Vaughn, who he identified himself as an independent Houston oil man, which was his CIA cover story. They took him downtown and questioned him and then released him, and he wound up back in front of the book depository, where I discovered his presence there in a photograph in Jesse Curry's paperback called Jesse Curry's Jfk Assassination File, where when Curry retired from being chief of police of Dallas, he became the head of security for 7-Eleven stores. So this book was only sold in 7-Eleven stores. And when I was pouring through, I noticed a photograph with this very familiar figure, tall, lanky, hand in his pocket, head at this distinctive angle. It was George H.W. Bush. I believe I was the first to identify him in that photograph. But it's all consistent with, when he became the head of the CIA, they claimed he was the first time a civilian was put in charge, but that was a complete poppycock. He'd actually been in charge of the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was codenamed Operation Zapata. The Bush oil family drilling company was Zapata. I believe had it been a success, they would have had the concession to drill all over the Caribbean basin. Two of the ships were rechristened, one Houston, the other Barbara, just before the invasion. It turns out, by the way, that Castro knew we were coming. The Soviets had learned the date of the invasion. The CIA had learned the Soviets knew. Castro knew. The only one who didn't know was JFK, because they were setting him up for a bait and switch. They knew this ragtag gang wasn't going to be successful, that Castro would round him up. He thought that JFK, the young and inexperienced president, would be confronted with the alternatives of sending in the Marines or taking egg on his face, and they were astonished when he chose to take responsibility rather than send in the Marines. So Bush was deeply involved in the CIA, deeply involved in the assassination. The key player turns out to have been Lyndon Johnson, however, who forced himself on the ticket in Los Angeles in 1960. JFK had already invited Stuart Symington of Missouri to be his running mate, but gave him overnight to think about it. Bobby went by the Johnson suite to extend a pro forma or courtesy offer and was dumbfounded when Lyndon jumped on it, using information provided to him by J. Edgar Hoover. He threatened to reveal that Jack, has suffered from Addison's disease, wasn't expected to live a long, healthy life, that he had had dalliances, some of whom were with beautiful women who were spies for East Germany, and both of those were true. And third, he said that if he were not on the ticket, then in his position as a powerful majority leader, he'd bottle up any legislative proposals sent down by the White House, which would be dead on arrival. Bobby and Jack tried to figure a way out of it, but Lyndon had them boxed in, and they had to accede to his demand. When one of Lyndon's wealthy financial backers learned about this, he burst into the Johnson suite cursing and swearing, because now LBJ was going to help JFK become president. Bobby Baker took him into a bedroom and explained to him what they had in mind. He came out all smiles and said he thought that was an excellent plan. Bobby would later declare in public JFK would not live out his first term and that he would die a violent death. In fact, Lyndon Johnson sent his chief administrative assistant, Cliff Carter, down to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination. Now, when you look at the various sponsors, you see the facilitators were Lyndon in bringing together the forces, tying together the CIA, the military, the Secret Service, with Edgar, who was a close personal friend and the godfather to one of his children, where Edgar used the FBI to tidy it up. where, for example, they didn't even interview the 10 closest witnesses to the Kennedy limousine, where others, they didn't ask important questions to which they had the answer. If any information got into the transcript or the record they didn't want, they simply changed the transcript. But when you look at the sponsors, they included the CIA. JFK was threatening to shatter the agency into 1,000 pieces. He'd already directed that its covert ops be supervised by the Pentagon. Neither of those parties was happy about it. The Joint Chiefs were upset because Jack had not invaded Cuba, contrary to their unanimous recommendation. He'd signed an above-ground test ban treaty with the Soviet Union against their unanimous opposition. Now he was going to pull our forces out of Vietnam, where the chiefs thought we had to take a stand against the expansion of international godless communism. The anti-Castro Cubans were upset because they felt Jack had betrayed them at the Bay of Pigs, which was false, but it was an impression the agency let stand because they didn't want their wrath or hostility to be directed toward the CIA. The mafia, of course, wanted Jack out because Bobby was bringing more indictments and convictions than ever before in history. Just as Edgar had sex dossiers on the members of Congress, the mafia had a sex dossier on Edgar, including photographs of him in a compromising position with his close personal friend Clyde Tolson. So that Edgar wasn't even able to acknowledge the existence of organized crime until after the Joe Valachi hearings, in which it was detailed the structure of the Cosa Nostra with such detail and precision it could no longer be politically denied. The Eastern establishment surrounding the Fed was upset because Jack had had the Department of the Treasury print United States notes, which had a red embossed imprint. I remember as a young Marine Corps officer holding one of these bills in my hand and noticing the difference, the red embossed imprint saying United States note, where he thought it was absurd for the government to be paying interest to a consortium of private banks for publishing the currency of the United States. And where the Texas oilmen were upset because Jack was threatening to cut the oil depletion allowance, a massive tax write-off on the ground that since they were pumping oil out of the ground and it was a finite resource, they were putting themselves out of business. It was frankly absurd. We have no more known oil reserves today than we ever have before in history. And last but not least, Israel. Because Jack was at loggerheads with David Ben-Gurion, a founder and a then prime minister of Israel, over their desire to develop nuclear weapons. Jack was opposed to it, wanted inspections at Dimona. In fact, Ben-Gurion appears to have resigned after instructing the Mossad to participate or assist in the assassination of JFK. So when you sort out the difference between the sponsors who wanted Jack out, primarily, except in the case of the anti-Castro Cubans for policy reasons, the mechanics, the actual shooters, or supervisors and coordinators, and the facilitators, who are the key players, you get some clarity. Plus, I would observe that once you understand the way in which the cover-up was executed, you can start eliminating candidates. For example, the KGB might have had the same ability to alter a film as the CIA, but there was no way they could have got their hands on a copy of the Zapruder. The Mafia could not have extended its reach into Bethesda Naval Hospital to alter x-rays under control of medical officers of the U.S. Navy, agents of the Secret Service, or the president's personal physician. And the other candidates, the anti-Castro Cubans, I mean, they could not have substituted someone else's brain for the brain of JFK. I mean, just looking at the evidence by an argument of elimination, you realize it's a very small group, and it's indeed the one that Noel Twyman, in his brilliant book, Bloody Treason, published already in 1997, had identified, namely collusion between Lyndon Johnson, J. Edgar Hoover, the American military, where they stole the body from Parkland Hospital to get it under military control so they could alter it, change the x-rays, change the photographs, and so forth. And, of course, the CIA and the Mafia. So Lyndon would go to the White House and schmooze with the Secret Service, Christine. He made himself very friendly with them. They resented the fact that JFK had lots of dalliances with women. I mean, he was quite a womanizer, but he really wasn't much of a lover. Angie Dickinson, for example, said that her affair with JFK was the greatest 15 seconds of her life. So the fact of the matter is, when you look at the big picture, that's what's crucial. I have a 2-hour overview that reviews all this on the Brian Ruhe, R-U-H-E show. So if you just put in the name Brian Ruhe, R-U-H-E, JFK, you'll have access to all the evidence, everything I'm describing here and now with you.
And for folks that are just tuning in, this is Out of the Box Radio. My guest this hour is Jim Fetzer. He is, as you can tell, a certified expert on the JFK assassination, and he's been involved in, I said earlier, hundreds of conferences. I'm going to say probably thousands at this point, multiple books. But before we go on, Jim, is there a way for people to get a hold of some of the stuff that you've written? Do you have a website, or do you have a book you want to throw out for people to get?
Well, my three original books are interesting in many different ways. For example, Vince Bugliosi, the celebrated prosecutor of Charles Manson, who published a book, Helter Skelter, about it, where Charlie has just gone to his just desserts for those who believe in heaven and hell. I don't think he's going to be comfortable. I'm an agnostic myself, but I think the world is glad that this monster is no longer dwelling among us. Vincent Bugliosi did a 1,500-page tome trying to resurrect the Warren Commission entitled Reclaiming History, where he observed in passing that mine were the only exclusively scientific books ever published on the assassination. Now, those would be available on Amazon.com, but I think maybe now only in a Kindle edition. I have a brand new book, however, my 4th book, just published this year, just a few months ago, entitled Jfk Who, How, and Why, which has 16 contributors. This brings you abreast of the current state of research on JFK, with one exception that developed this weekend I'll tell you about momentarily, so that you can find my books. Since I retired after a 35-year career as a college professor offering courses primarily in logic, critical thinking, and scientific reasoning, in 2006, I've been devoting myself to, studying the cases where the government has been perpetrating frauds on the American people. It's quite a wide range of issues. We have a brand new book on Charlottesville, for example, which was a complete sham. It was we had 2 cars, 2 drivers, 2 or even 3 takes. I tried to alert the university of what was going on, but they took no interest. Anyway, we have a brand new book on Charlottesville. We have previous books on the Boston bombing. We have books on Sandy Hook. We have books on the moon landing. We have books on Orlando, Dallas. I mean, go to moonrockbooks.com and poke around and see what you find of interest, but in particular in relation to JFK. This is the only book that explains how they altered the Zapruder film, including, there's over 1,000 photographs in this book, including 486 frames from the Zapruder film, Christina. How the crucial role of the Alton Six Photograph, this is a most famous photograph taken by Associated Press photographer James Alton, who caught Lee Oswald in the doorway, as we've been able to confirm, in which we reaffirmed during this conference this last weekend in Dallas, which was organized by Judith Very Baker, who was Lee Oswald's girlfriend in New Orleans the summer before. She's published a book about it entitled Me and Lee, which has been attacked by the government because they don't want people to realize that Lee Oswald actually had been working for the government, that he was recruited by the Office of Naval Intelligence when he was a recruit in San Diego, where I would subsequently serve as a series commander and have 15 DIs and 300 recruits under my command. He would then be stationed at Atsugi, our most secure base in Japan. He'd conduct a pseudo defection to the Soviet Union. Because he'd been a radar operator, he knew the altitude at which these U-2 overflights were taking place, which he was able to provide to the Soviets at the request of the CIA. Khrushchev and Eisenhower were going to have a summit intended to reduce Cold War tensions, but Khrushchev accused Eisenhower of spying on the Soviet Union. Eisenhower denied it, and Khrushchev was able to produce a pilot, Gary Francis Power, who had not taken his cyanide tablet, and parts of the U-2, which they'd been able to shoot down. Lee would marry the niece of a KGB colonel and return to the United States, where he was not treated as though he had been a traitor, but rather met by a CIA front organization, gave him money to relocate. where Marina wound up in Dallas with a family with ties to the CIA, who had later assisted getting him a job at the book depository just 2 weeks before the assassination, where he went to New Orleans and was photographed, for example, handing out pamphlets for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in an effort to sheep dip him, to give him the false persona of a pro-Castro communist sympathizer they would use to frame him in Dallas subsequently for the assassination. Now, what we have here so you can go to moonrockbooks.com. You can also go to my blog at jamesfetzer.blogspot.com, where my latest blog reflects the blockbuster developments here. The title, JFK, Bethesda Autopsy Photos, Not JFK. Oswald framed, Warren report a sham, where I report new research where we took photographs that had appeared in Robert Groden's book, The Killing of a President, published in 1994, widely regarded as a definitive treatment of the photographic evidence in the death of JFK, where he has long since touted a couple of autopsy photographs of the president as being, crucial to the understanding. Well, we have done a superposition of the profile of JFK over the autopsy photographs, and it's not the body of JFK. In other words, the autopsy photographs that were used and distributed as authentic are not. They're not even the body of JFK. That's one of the blockbuster findings. We also confirmed their previous research by Larry Rivera, who's been doing a brilliant job of using computer technology to analyze and investigate cases of this kind. Where, for example, using computer technology, we were able to prove that Noah Posner, the most famous of the children who allegedly died at Sandy Hook, was actually made up out of photographs of the person who was supposed to be his older stepbrother, Michael Wagner, when he was a child. We've been able to prove it. Larry did an overlay where you can see Noah Posner turn into Michael Wagner. I mean, it's truly shocking. You can find that one on my blog at Sandy Hook Charade. Noah Posner was Michael Wagner as a child. In fact, that's one of two books of mine, Nobody Died at Sandy Hook, that have been banned by Amazon.com because they blow the official story out of the water. That one has 13 contributors, including 6 current or retired PhD college professors. Other contributors include Paul Preston, who was a superintendent of schools in the LA area, who has actually supervised drills of this kind, who was so bothered by what he saw being broadcast from Newtown that day that he reached out to his contacts in the Obama Department of Education, all of whom confirmed to him that it had been a drill, that no children had died, and that was done to promote gun control. We even have the FEMA manual for the 2-day exercise with a rehearsal on the 13th, going live on the 14th of 2012. Many of the participants became confused and put up donation sites already on the 13th, the day before the shooting. Adam Lanza, the fictional shooter, even had his death recorded in the Social Security death index as having died on the 13th, making his feat in shooting 20 kids and 6 adults the following day all the more remarkable. So Larry has done brilliant work on the man in the doorway, because in the Altons in the background, there's this area where many have believed that the figure who's peering out was Lee Oswald. We'd previously established he had the right height, weight, build, clothing, shirt, T-shirt that Lee Oswald was wearing when he was arrested. They were so concerned about the similarity in the photograph, they had him take out his outer shirt, which was a long-sleeved, richly textured shirt that he'd purchased in Russia. Marina would eventually tell Ed Tatro that she remembered having laundered that shirt. But they took it off and photographed him, his mugshot, in a T-shirt, so people wouldn't notice the resemblance. The government has maintained that it was a co-worker of Lee's, Billy Lovelady, who was the figure in the doorway. And during the Warren Commission, they went through a lot of convoluted moves to try to make that plausible. Harold Weisberg, in his Whitewash series, already in 1966, pointed out in the second volume, Photographic Whitewash, in the last few pages, how the Warren staff was going out of their way to try to show that it wasn't Oswald in the doorway, when in fact it was. Even Jim Garrison, who was a key figure in Oliver Stone's film JFK, had long since concluded it was Lee in the doorway, Well, we not only knew from the height, weight, build, shirt, and T-shirt that it wasn't Billy. Billy himself said it was odd they'd be confused because he was 2 to 3 inches shorter, 15 to 20 pounds heavier, probably closer to 30 pounds. He'd actually gone to the FBI on the 29th of February wearing the shirt he'd worn on that occasion, which was a short-sleeved red and white vertically striped shirt. Looked nothing at all like the shirt on Doorman. I mean, so what they did was they obfuscated the photograph. They put a figure behind Lee. It was also in front of Lee, so that Doorman. So that Doorman is missing his left shoulder, which is an anatomical impossibility. And Billy had raised his hands up to protect his eyesight from the sun. So they obfuscated his shirt. I mean, it's obvious he's wearing a short sleeve shirt, but the fact that it was vertically striped would have stood out. So I completely whited it out. Larry has been able to do overlays that show not only are the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, and the T-shirt the same as Lee, but the facial features are those of Lee Oswald, not those of Billy Lovelady. He's also been able to confirm that Billy Lovelady was indeed the figure with his hands raised. He's done a reconstruction of what the doorway area would have looked like had it been colorized, and you would have seen Billy standing out with his vertically striped red and white short sleeve shirt. So this is all in that blog. But in addition, we've been able to prove that the backyard photographs where Jim Mars and I had published an article entitled Framing the Patsy, the Case of Lee Harvey Oswald. We'd gone through the backyard photograph where Lee is shown holding a Mannlicher Carcano. He's got a pistol belt with a revolver with which he's alleged to have shot Officer J.D. Tippett. He's holding 2 communist newspapers, the Worker and the Militant. We'd already gone through to explain all the evidence that this was fake. When he was shown one of these photographs, Lee Oswald said that was his face pasted on someone else's body and he'd be able to prove it because he knew something about photography. Well, he didn't live to see the day, but Jim Mars and I did, building on the research of Jack White and even of Judith Very Baker, who's proven quite brilliant at research. He has a square jaw. It's not Lee Oswald's more tapered jaw. There's an insert line between the jaw and the lower lip. The face is the same across 3 or 4. There are like 4 of these photographs, and the face is identical, which is an optical impossibility. The fingertips of the right hand are cut off. Jack White knew that these newspapers have a known dimension, so you can use it as a ruler from the bottom of the sole of the foot to the top of the head. When you do that, turns out the guy standing in for Lee is too short, only 5'6", or else, when Lee was about 5'10", or else they introduced the newspapers too large when they fabricated the photograph, which is exactly what they did. Jim Mars and I had already concluded, based upon the chin, the height, the weight, the build, and a funny bump on the forearm of the right arm, that it had been Roscoe White, who was a Dallas police officer, who actually his son discovered his diary. He was working for the CIA. He appears to have been the stand-in for Lee Oswald, as Jim Mars and I already concluded. Well, Larry found a suitable photograph of Roscoe White and was able to impose it, and it's an exact fit. There's no doubt this is Roscoe White. So what we presented here at this conference this last weekend completely blows the case apart. The body that is photographed in the Bethesda autopsy photographs is not the body of JFK. We have a question of whether it could be the officer who was shot in Dallas, J.D. Tippett, who bore a striking resemblance to JFK. We've been able to prove so far that it's not JFK. We have not been able to prove yet that it is Officer J.D. Tippett, but there's a longtime student of JFK, Robert Morningstar, who's insisted for decades that actually they used Tippett instead of JFK. We'll see if we can prove it to be the case or not. That is future research. Well, he's also shown, confirmed now, beyond any doubt, that Lee Oswald was standing in the doorway, which not only means he cannot have been the lone demented gunman, but he cannot have even been one of the multiple shooters, and that the backyard photographs were fabricated by pasting his face on someone else's body, where the body double for him turns out to be this NYPD police officer, Roscoe White. So that's the latest, Christine. I mean, I'm telling you, this is the current state of research on JFK. The whole official government cover-up has been blown apart forever.
And this should be this should be front page news. This should be covered on all the media. I have a feeling that this week there's going to be, again, the carting out of the picture of Lee Harvey Oswald with the rifle and the manifesto, a reiteration that this lone gunman, it's just a retelling of the story time and time again, but yet thanks to podcasts, thanks to the web, the World Wide Web, people are seeking out this information for themselves. My question to you is do you think, Jim Fetzer, do you think that this will ever come out fully as being a coordinated assassination from elements within the government? And my other question, because I really wanted to get your opinion on this. Trump supposedly had released some JFK files. I don't know. I just had heard about it. Have you taken a look at it? Is everything redacted? What do you think about that?
Well, here's the thing. You see, when they created the Assassination Record Review Board in 1992, there was a 25-year deadline, which brings it to 2017 for the release of all the documents. Trump was appealed to by the CIA, didn't want them all released, but he went ahead and released them anyway. We're still going through them, but there are some gems there. For example, it turns out that the mayor of Dallas, Earl Cabell, the brother of Charles Cabell, the three-star lieutenant general in the Air Force, who was deputy director of the CIA at the Bay of Pigs, whom JFK dismissed, along with the other deputy director, Richard Bissell, because of the way in which they set him up for the bait and switch, joined the CIA in 1956. Earl Cabell, the mayor of Dallas at the time of the assassination, had joined the CIA in 1956. Now, in that capacity, he supervised the police department, motorcade, ceremonial activities. He was deeply involved in all of this. We have another revelation coming from an informant that the KGB in 1965 was requesting all the information that would be available about Lyndon Johnson, his background, his history, his associates, his sources of funding and all that, because the KGB had now concluded that Lyndon Johnson was responsible for the death of John F. Kennedy. And of course, that's exactly right. Now, the reason you're not hearing about it is because the CIA, through what's called Operation Mockingbird, has been infesting the media massively, so that as early as 1975, William Colby, then its director, testified to Congress that the agency owned everyone of significance in the media. At that time, there was no alternative media, so they owned everyone of significance in the media. Carl Bernstein published an article for Rolling Stone entitled "The CIA and the Media," in which he reported that the highest officials of the agency were boasting that their greatest successes had been with Time Life, the New York Times, and CBS. And that in that era, Christine, if you controlled Time Life, the New York Times, and CBS, you had a lock on news in the United States. So that, the situation has only become worse. And this is why, of course, the mainstream doesn't publish the truth. It been Will Rogers who observed that, you're better off not reading the newspapers, because if you read the newspapers, your beliefs are all going to be false, and that you're worse off having the false beliefs than you're having true ones. The government has been going nonstop to try to prevent information about the assassination from coming out. But, this latest book is a perfect example. I had my first book, Sandy Hook, banned by Amazon.com less than a month after it went on sale. It had sold nearly 500 copies. This is 22 October 2015, banned on 19 November 2015, because it blows the case apart. They had 20 books on Sandy Hook, 19 of which agree with the government account, only one that takes exception. So they banned that book. I therefore immediately release it for free as a PDF. If you just go to your browser and type in "nobody died at Sandy Hook," you can download for free the PDF of the book, and you'll have all the pictures in resplendent color, including 50 where they're furnishing an empty house to be the Adam Lanza resident. You can tell this is a fraud. This isn't a real home that's been lived in, because there's nothing on the walls. No photographs, no paintings, no pictures, nothing on the walls at all. We also have 50 of them refurbishing the school, which had been closed since 2008 because it was loaded with asbestos and other biohazards damaged by hurricanes. There was a big flood in the area in 2007. Christine, it's just outrageous, but the American people need to understand how they've been duped again and again and again, which is why I think it's so important for me to bring together experts on Sandy Hook, the Boston bombing, Orlando, Dallas, even the moon landing, which was also a fraudulent event for political reasons. The United States was embarrassed when the Soviets put up Sputnik. JFK promised to go to the moon. He was never told it wasn't even possible. We didn't have the propulsion power. We didn't have the computing power. NASA recently announced that the Van Allen radiation belt was the greatest obstacle to a manned mission to Mars. Well, the Van Allen radiation belt has been around for 4.5 billion years, as long as Earth. If it's an obstacle now, it's an obstacle then. The fact is they recently found a treasure trove of moon landing video, which would have been priceless had it been real, which NASA destroyed, because with modern techniques, you can expose the fakery in the videos. And get this, Christine, this is almost hilarious. NASA has put out a $20,000 reward for assistance in solving its space poop problem. Right now, they can only handle human excrement up to 14 days, Christine, which is stunning because these moon missions took over a week, 7 or 8 days. But they could only handle 14 days, which is proof that the whole space program and the claims we landed on the moon are nothing but a massive, gigantic pile of space poop.
What a great way to end the show, on space poop, Jim Fetzer. Oh my God! And it seems not only with, of course, with JFK and Bobby Kennedy, and so many of these tragic events that have happened and have shaped policy, right? Have shaped how this continual war machine that happens time and time again. I know also with the work that you've done also on 9/11, the drills that were happening on 9/11, the drills that seem to be happening whenever there's a drill. I want folks to just, perk up and be aware. Whenever there's a drill, there's something's not kosher. Something is.
Christine, I'm already beginning editing a book on Las Vegas. It was a movie. They had a pre-recorded soundtrack. They played over the amplifier system of actual machine guns. Even hearing bullets strike the ground, no real shots were fired. They had coordinated visual effects of flashing lights to simulate a machine gun above it, three light blasts to simulate American weapons. They had seated the crowd with crisis actors they'd been recruiting 15 days in advance to react on cue so everyone would run. We have so much proof that nobody died, that the patients in the hospitals were fake. American military surgeons said they were all actors. None of them had suffered a wound. An American trauma surgeon observed they weren't even connected to the diagnostic equipment that monitors their blood pressure and condition. We've looked at 33 videos. There's lots of sounds of shots, no actual shots. And we have brilliant work on the obituaries, discovering that case after case after case is based upon someone who died in a different state or on a different date or from a different cause of death.
Wow. Folks, I hope your brain is probably right now spinning and spinning and spinning. That's a good thing. We want you to go check out the work that Jim Fetzer has done. You can go to jamesfetzer.blogspot.com. You can also go to moonrockbooks.com. And I encourage you to check them out, and look also on Amazon for the work of Jim Fetzer. Again, thank you so very much. On this week marking the 54th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and giving us so much more, Jim Fetzer. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thanks, Christine. My great pleasure.
And folks, I want to remind you that if you never want to miss an episode of Out of the Box Radio, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or iHeartRadio, or better yet, subscribe to the YouTube channel. When you subscribe to that, you can send the shows to friends and family, post it on your social media. It's just a much easier way to get the information out. Until next week, I want to remind you to always think outside of the box. Bye for now.